Welcome everybody to this. This is unlike anything Bark's done before. I'm very excited about it because we get to have a discussion about art and story and history as it relates to the work that we do, the legacy of those who came before us, and kind of what our place in that is, and how the movement has changed and continues to change. And I really want to thank Aaron for agreeing to do this. This isn't the kind of thing that he's done before. And so it'll be fun to pick the creative mind. I want to ask everyone, I know that we can sometimes be fierce, but let's go easy on him. Ask good questions. And Aaron, I will vouch for Aaron being a good guy. So I look forward to this conversation with you all. Before we get going in the conversation itself, though, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to talk a little bit more about Bark and lead us in our land acknowledgement practice that we do at the beginning of all of our events.
Thanks, Brenna. Hi, everybody. I'm Courtney Ray, and I'm Bark's Associate Director. So welcome to our Zoom meeting space. We are opening all of our meeting spaces with acknowledgement practice. So if you've been in one of our meetings recently, you should have a notebook or I have note cards from previous practices, and you should definitely grab those to, review your work. So this is both a statement and a practice. So I'll ask for your attention for about 5 minutes. If you have anything else going on, it'd be great if you could just set that aside. So for Bark, as an organization that was founded by white people in a settler colonial lineage, we know that this organization is part of land theft and the erasure of Native authority over the lands that we now refer to as public lands in Mount Hood National Forest. And as an organization, over the last 20 years, we have established an influential relationship with the Forest Service, part of the same federal government that facilitated violent land theft, colonization, and displacement of Native peoples, including through the very creation of public lands and national forests. And across this continent, all non-Native people now have access and privilege to this land only because of the violent legacy that came before. So right now we are working to transform our organization to, first of all, acknowledge that implicit participation in the displacement of Native people, and also to accept responsibility for this inherited legacy and these unearned privileges. We here at Bark, we are committed to practices of acknowledgement, respect, and support for the Malalas, Calipunians, Chinook and Clackamas, Chinook and Wasco, and Northern Paiute people who live here and who have always lived here, and the many, many other Native nations who have always been a part of this land and cared for it, where we are now occupiers. If there are any Native folks in our space tonight who have anything that they think we should hear, would like to share, I would like to respectfully invite you to do so. You can unmute and I will just wait and see.
My name is Lindsay. I'm fighting capitalism. I'm biracial, Haudenosaunee, and German Irish. And my boyfriend, a partner, is Potawatomi, Dakota, and Lakota. His name is Makovu. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him, but he is also fighting the Forest Service because of the horrible stuff they're doing to wildlife, especially the wolves. And I'm new, and I really like what you guys are doing, so I'm hoping to work with you guys and also learn, because I'm kind of focusing on, getting land back and abolishing slavery and getting reparations and conciliations made for, the Christians and the Catholics with the doctrine of discovery stuff. But it's all correlating, and COVID is a blessing in disguise. So thank you for having me. Kalapuya territory, I should have said. We're on occupied Kalapuya territory. It's also known as Corvallis.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Lindsay, and for sharing your perspective and making sure that people are aware of the impact of, this history on people today. For all the rest of us, all the non-native people, I'm gonna ask you to take a minute now, grab your notebook or writing utensils. And I want you to think about what practicing acknowledgement looks like or can look like for you in the life that you live. What can you do? What actions can you take? I won't tell you what to do. I want you to use your own powers of imagination. If it means starting with research and learning, that's a great place to start. So for a minute, just to write to yourself about your intentions and plans to action. All right, and now turning away from thinking about yourself, and you can set your journaling aside. I would ask for one more moment of silence in contemplation and respect for this history and your individual place in it, our collective place in it, and to, in silence, express our humble gratitude and apology for the original people who are here tonight, who are all across these lands in the past, present, and the future. I appreciate your attention to this important practice, and I hope you will continue not only when you are prompted to, but to prompt yourself to do this kind of acknowledgement in practice in all the spaces that you occupy. So thank you all for supporting Bark in these practices as well. And we will now begin our presentation for the evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And thanks for Lindsay for sharing. And I, again, want to draw attention to the link that you put in the chat. It's a fantastic mapping tool. And I would advocate, if people don't already know the tribes whose land they live on, to check that out and find out. So thank you for that. And now we're going to launch into a conversation. There's so many ways, so many things I want to say to start it. I'll just start by saying that it can be hard to know how to tell history, especially when you're telling a history where almost everyone you're speaking about is still around and still there and still listening to how you tell that story. And I want to start by introducing Erin and doing some kind of big picture questions about the podcast, The Timber Wars. And then just so people know where we're going with this evening, we're then going to touch in on each episode. I have a couple of questions that I pulled out of each one, and we'll allow some time for questions from the rest of you also. We want to get, we definitely want to get through to episode 7, especially because I know that there's questions and thoughts about that, and then beyond. So after doing some kind of big picture discussion about the podcast, we'll go through each episode. If you haven't seen them all, that's fine. Or sorry, heard them all, visualized them. You can go back and listen afterwards and think about this conversation and really think about how this story is still so alive. And you definitely said it a few times, the Timber Wars did not end, and we are still part of them, part of living that history. So that's the kind of settle of the evening. I'll start us off. I'll start off, discussing questions with each episode. If other people want to chime in, that's awesome. We have an hour and a half together tonight. And I'm sure that there are things that we are not going to be able to get to, but I hope this whets our imagination about story and what's more like our imagination about the forest and all of the people who love it, even though they come in different forms than maybe we expect them to. So with that intro, I want to just again say thank you so much to Erin for joining us. I started talking to Erin about this podcast back when we could still meet in person at a coffee shop, really discussing like what it might look like. So I just want to, I know you did so much work getting ready for this. So I want to just give it to you to say, like, what brought you to this point? Both personally, how did you get here? This story, this topic, how did you get here? And the format, the podcast, which you said was new for OPB. So like all of those, you want to just introduce us to how that came to be?
Yeah. I guess to the first part of that question, how did I get here? Just really quick. I was born in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And to me, it's in the Rocky Mountains surrounded by incredible forest. And so for me, growing up, the forest was the place that you hiked and you camped and you played. It never occurred to me that it was, of course, the place where we logged too, because the trees there are not trees that are being commercially logged right now. My mother moved here to Portland to go to naturopathic school when I was around 8. And so I bounced back and forth between here and there. And then I pretty much lived here post-college. And so my first experience of these great, drippy, mossy forests in the Northwest, it was more as a teenager, and it was driving to the coast and seeing clear cuts for the first time was definitely my introduction to these stories, at least from a visual perspective. I was too young at the time. I mean, I moved here the same year as the Easter massacre and kind of as the initial spotted owl injunctions. I was too young to know they were going on. I mentioned this later in the podcast, find that I recently found in one of my middle school yearbooks from Colorado that the current events page was dedicated to the Iraq War and the Timber Wars. So like even in my little town of Colorado, like this was something that was penetrating into the 7th grade minds of the yearbook committee there. So I guess, yeah, Portland to me feels like home. The Northwest feels like home. I was not born here. How we came to this at OPB, the science and environment team likes to kind of tackle a big project every year. And, the arbitrary way we divide things, it's like this year we're going to do wildfire, which is what we did 2 years ago. It's often driven by one of my colleagues, Tony Schick, who's our investigative reporter and kind of the big project he sinks his teeth into, which then a lot of us try to find things around that. So like he was looking at wildfire in the ways that the Forest Service is not practicing the science that their own scientists are kind of researching and preaching. The piece I did for that was looking much more at what are the plants and the animals that need fire to survive. And so this past year, my executive editor, Ed Yan, noticed it was the 30th anniversary of the Spotted Owls listing. And he thought that this would be a really great time to look back because journalists really love anniversaries. But it was immediately clear to all of us that, this is not looking back to tell a historical story that is gone and past and not, something that affects us anymore. It was very much with the goal of this moment transform the Northwest in ways that we live with still, and in ways that people like myself who moved here and kind of came of age after it just don't even realize. So I think for me, going through the forests on Mount Hood, I always just kind of assumed hiking through them like, oh, these are, natural virgin forests the way they've always been. It never really occurred to me that these are second or third growth forests that have been replanted and that have been fought over. And it didn't, the ways that it reshaped our politics and reshaped our economic relationships, reshaped the urban-rural divide particularly. So, our goal with the podcast was very much to explore what are the ways this conflict that really started blazing in the 80s and 90s reshaped and continued to shape who we are in the Northwest. So if we had to, we got selected for this NPR Story Lab little podcast incubator, and they, took us through this process of kind of defining your audience and defining your roadmap. And so that very much if we had to define that primary audience, it was people who did not live through this, either because they're too young or because they moved here since it happened, to help them see the forest that they moved here, in many cases that they moved here for, in a different light, and hopefully kind of enrich their relationship and complicate their relationship to the forests that we just kind of take for granted, as well as in many cases, I mean, we assume that the majority of our listeners are probably urban. And so it's very important to us to deepen their understanding of the small towns that they drive through when they're going to recreate in the woods. Or if they live in those small towns, we've had a lot of listeners write back who say, you know, I moved here from somewhere else because this was a picturesque, beautiful town. But what I didn't really know was anything about the history. So that was kind of the kernel of the project. The reason it was a podcast, my boss actually really wanted to do a documentary because he comes from Oregon Field Guide, our nature TV show, and that's where I primarily work. And so he was kind of like, we should do an hour-long special. And I was like, yeah, that's great, but there weren't cameras at so many of the big things that happened, and you're really much confined to what there's footage of when you're doing a documentary. So I suggested we can do that, but we should maybe do a little podcast on the side in which we talk to people and get to actually go deeper into stories. And he kind of bit on that, and we ended up running with that instead of the documentary. Also in large part because OPB's undergoing a lot of changes at the moment, so we didn't have a whole lot of bandwidth to take on a big documentary project. But yeah, so that was kind of the beginning, and then it was all about reaching out to people and reading books and trying to figure out there's so many pieces to this story, so many ways to tell it. No side is a monolith. And I mean, this constant struggle in telling a story like this is that you tend to have to reduce things in order to fit them into a certain amount of space and keep people's attention. So it was trying to figure out what are the moments that we're going to really dwell in? What are the actions? I mean, do we start with Bald Mountain, like some of the first Earth First protests back in '83? Do we start with Easter Sunday, which is maybe one of the earlier ones to get big national attention? Do we start with the owl? Do we tell it chronologically? Do we pick just one person and follow them through the whole process? Do we jump around? Do we start today? I mean, for a while, we thought about starting with kind of timber unity and the fight over cap and trade, because that was where we originally planned to end. And so do we start today and then telegraph back? So the creative joy, I guess, was trying to figure that out, combined with the anxiety and heartache and complication of deciding where do we focus and who do we talk to, and which of the many people we talk to do we not end up getting to include. So, and I have to thank Brenna, because she was the first person who suggested Tim and Katya, who are with us tonight, as people to speak with. And they then, of course, ended up shaping the series very much, in large part because of the roles they played through the years. And so that became one thread, and I mean, Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson were another thread, and trying to figure out what are little threads that we can pull people through so there's a sense of continuity. But no person was everywhere at once, and no person expresses every side. So it also involved a lot of bouncing around. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'd stop there and let you ask question number 2.
Well, I think question number 2 is almost more of an observation, and I think it's kind of almost, it wove through to me, looking at the whole picture, was the idea that what this whole timber war was around, it was a culture war. And how it feels like, you know, I've lived in Portland since '93. And it feels like we're at a time now where we're kind of back into a culture war more than we've been almost since that time. So it's like, to me, that was one of the huge pieces of the relevance of this. And at the end, I actually want to talk about timber unity. That's in my notes. Like, how do you see this all connecting? But that sense that what we're talking about is this change of culture. And if we go in with those eyes, you know, it's Bill Clinton who said it also there, that this is about change. It's about ecosystem changing, and it's about people having to adapt to that. So to me, that was a really interesting thread that I didn't get, because at the beginning, I just listened to them one per week, but getting ready for this podcast, I just binge listened to them all so I could hear that thread weaving through. And I guess like, how does that land with you? Would you also say that on the big telegraph out, it's more about a cultural change than almost anything?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think we end up focusing more on that. I mean, that was in many ways the story we wanted to tell, and we wanted to try to the best of our abilities, tell it through eyes on both sides. Or I mean, sometimes I want to say three sides, because I feel like the government was kind of its own thing, and we don't spend a lot of time inside the Forest Service and the BLM and kind of looking at things through their eyes as well.
And that was the question. Would they not talk to you? I noticed they were conspicuously absent.
It was, mostly it was more a matter of there just wasn't the time and the space, and there were other stories that we wanted to tell a little bit more. I mean, I spoke with a number of retired people. The people that I tried to interview still at the Forest Service, it's a little more of the rigmarole and going through public information officers. And so in some cases, I didn't pursue it because I didn't feel like they would be as frank an interview as we wanted. I mean, one of the stories I really wish we could have told that we didn't have space for was a place where the Northwest Forest Plan kind of worked out in the South Law. Mm-hmm. And look at some place where they really tried to implement it. And that would have been very much an internal kind of more Forest Service focused story, but we didn't have the time. But yes, to your question, I think it's hugely a social story. It's a story about people, and it's a story about how we relate to each other. And for me, that was really an eye-opening piece as someone who lives in the city, and I grew up in a small town, and I had friends who were ranchers, but I did not grow up in a ranching family, and I did not grow up in a family that, I mean, I take it back, my dad is a mining engineer, so I did grow up in a family that has experience with extractive industries, but not really of that culture. And I mean, for me, that was a huge thing, is spending time with these loggers, is to them, the Northwest Forest Plan and the spotted owl are alive in ways that they are not to most of us who live in cities. I feel like, I mean, most of the people I know who I'd talk to about the podcast, they kind of be like, the Northwest Forest Plan. Oh yeah, I think I remember hearing about the spotted owl. Like, I mean, most people who didn't live through it are kind of, it's on the edge of their mind, and it's not present, and it's not a living document the way that it is for so many people who live in these more timber dependent communities, where like your life is impacted every day by the Northwest Forest Plan, by the way this is all played out. And so that sense of resentment definitely has fed into where we are today politically, and definitely fed into the rise of timber unity, and why it is that it's timber leading the charge against cap and trade and against any sort of regulations that would attempt to curb climate change. I mean, because that's kind of the group that organized and the group that really defined an identity. I mean, it's interesting to me. I feel like oftentimes our sense of identity is defined by opposition, and the feeling that the coalescing that creates in your group. And like, I mean, I think here in Portland, particularly, like the queer community very much came together during the fights against the Oregon Christian Alliance and the propositions that were trying to make it illegal to teach anything pro-gay in schools. And I mean, it was very much by having these ballot measures that were trying to demonize you that created this sense of community, and in many ways created political power, because people were organizing and they were working together. And I think you see that in rural and more conservative communities here that used to be maybe a little bit more mixed, and there used to be unions, strong unions in the timber industry that warned that we were overcutting.
Hey, we're going to get to that in episode 4. You're getting ahead of yourself. I want to talk about that.
it is, I think, very much a social story of humans. And I mean, we tried, like, I really wanted to do the science. My producer, editor, cut it back so much because I wanted to revel in the science of the forest, and we had to really kind of pull it back. And so there were things like, a part of me wishes I could have done 7 episodes just about forests and how wonderful they are. But we very much chose to make this a story about the people and the cultural dynamic, and trying to let people speak for themselves in ways that would maybe create some empathy or at least some illumination for the other side, or for people who might not identify with a logger and environmentalist. Maybe they'd listen to this and be like, oh, I have a little bit more understanding into this person who I normally think of as them, as someone to oppose. So I mean, that was a strong goal.
Well, with that, that kind of weaves right into my reflections on episode 1, starting with the Easter Massacre, starting with the contested old growth sale that the loggers went out and tried to cut down before a court could enjoin it. And the environmentalists were there trying to throw themselves in front of the machines to stop it. And you start with a logger. Right. And it's a fantastic conversation. You know, it definitely seemed like the kind of person I wanted to sit down and have a cup of tea with and listen to him play classical music on his baby grand. But there was one comment that he made and that really struck me. And I'm wondering, like, how sincere was your gauge in this? Like, when he said in the 70s and 80s, we thought we were going to do this forever. Right. And that, I was like, how could he have thought they were going to do it forever? Like, did they not know that old growth trees were a finite resource, right? Like, it just, you know, this discordant thing that actually kept coming up through this. And perhaps this is wholly my own perspective of coming from a place where I see old growth trees as a finite resource, see them as something that is only going to be in, you know, takes 800 years to grow some of those trees that they were cutting down. Did you come across that often? Like, people who really, truly were surprised by the fact that they had to stop logging old growth? And is it possible that they would have ever come to this on their own without the owl? Because we literally would have run out of old growth.
I mean, I think to them, they don't make the old growth differentiation. Like, and I still, to this day, the loggers, I mean, still refer to it as rotting. Like, in their mind, those are forests that are susceptible to insects, they're susceptible to rot, they're susceptible to fire. And like, therefore we should cut it down and replant it with new kind of quote unquote thrifty forests. So I think it wasn't the feeling that the old growth would last forever. I think it was the feeling that the logging would last forever, and that we were going to cut the old growth first because it's fallen down, and then we're going to plant something, and then we'll come back in, you know, back then it was more 60, 80 years. Now it's more 20, 30 years, and we're going to cut it again. So I think that is that kind of battle of worldviews. Like, to them, and to talking to people in these communities, it's still, if they use the word renewable in the way that I feel like environmentalists use the word renewable, of like a renewable resource. And to them, trees are the ultimate renewable resource. And
to us, old growth forests are not renewable. Yeah. Like, trees might be, but trees and forests are different things.
Yeah.
And that might be the disconnect.
And I think that's the disconnect. I think to a lot of people, they're not. That it's the same thing. And if anything, kind of the 40, 60-year-old stands are more beautiful and kind of better forests than old growth.
But they don't have as much volume.
What's that?
I mean, there's no way that they could have as much actual volume, like as much economic worth.
No, I think, but it's better hunting. It looks better. It's, you know, quote unquote, more fire resistant. Like, I think this really comes down to kind of this different perspective of, and, you know, when I would push people about like, yeah, but like Opal Creek, because I mean, Mill City, and we don't really get into this, but I mean, the conflict there, like Easter Massacre was big, but it was really about Opal Creek.
Yeah.
And I didn't really dive into that in large part because the two main people in that fight are no longer with, I mean, it's George Attia had a stroke at the time. I mean, now I deeply regret not having a conversation with him. And then Mag Creek Logging, I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but kind of the two people, I mean, there's been books written about it, but it's, I press some of the loggers of like, I mean, come on, like who can not walk through Opal Creek and feel like this is somehow a beautiful place that needs protecting? But their response, I shouldn't say they, one of the responses I got was very much this feeling of, we did protect it. We have national parks, we have wilderness areas. Like in a lot of ways, the conflict that went on before this over wilderness areas was very much kind of these logging side of things being like, okay, and the Republican senators being like, okay, we'll let environmentalists have these wilderness areas and we get the rest. And then there was the feeling that, wait, we just compromised and now you're asking for more. And so I think in their minds, there was the feeling of, well, we did protect the old growth. We protected as much as we needed. And then the rest of this is for logging and replanting and logging and replanting and going on. And I, you know, there were a couple, I did have two loggers who, while I wasn't recording, were being like, yeah, you're probably cutting a little bit too fast, maybe cutting a little bit too much. At the same point, the entire machine was convinced that it was quote unquote sustained yields. And I mean, they had their scientists who would testify before Congress saying, you know, we're cutting at a sustainable rate. And we're also stepping in because the private timber owners had overlogged their land. So like in many ways, historically, the reason the government, the federal forests kind of upped its logging quotas was to kind of fill this gap, while then these private forests regrew to a point where we could return to logging those. Because I mean, earlier on, private industry didn't want a lot of federal logging because it would drive down the cost of that they could sell their private trees for. But I do think, I mean, it very much was the feeling of we've protected enough old growth. Like we already compromised and now we're being asked for more. Mm-hmm. And this feeling of kind of the moving goalposts. So I think it's a different perspective.
It is. And you know, I can't wish rationality on anyone. You know, I think there's a part of me that says you can't have a sustained yield if in your future forests are going to have significantly less volume because they're not old growth. I mean, just that, but that isn't the mindset that other folk have going in when they just, again, thought it would just be able to persist indefinitely and didn't maybe even want to look at the end, because if they would have looked at it, it would have been scary. But I want to jump to the environmentalists, if I may, step aside away from the loggers. We'll get back to them in episode 4, because I wanted to turn the mic over to Tim and Katya for a moment. We're pleased to have you with us. Hi, friends. Hi. I will say Tim and Katya are some of my utter heroes, people who started in the environmental movement and stayed and have been badass activists since then, not only raised a family, but raised generations of other little activists like me to stay in it. So I'm super happy that you can be with us. And I wanted to bring you in to ask almost 2 questions. First, what was it like to tell your story? And then what was it like hearing your story told back to you and interspersed with the others?
Well, gosh, we're showing our age, but that was 30 freaking years ago.
More than.
And, you know, the mists of time have kind of corroded parts of my brain. It was really, you know, it was challenging. Like, what was, you know, not just what were the events, you kind of remember that, but what was the feeling of the times? And even now I'm getting goosebumps right now. It's hard to, you know, to appreciate it, but in those times, especially when I was working in the general forest, I was spending 10-hour workdays in clear cuts that were moonscapes, and just seeing the scale of it. I thought I was witnessing the end of the world unfolding right before my eyes. And those were the stakes. And so, you know, I've kind of forgotten that, but isn't that the times we're living in now? especially for young activists witnessing what they feel like is the end of the world unfolding before their eyes now. And, I guess, here we are 30 years later, and we did save the ancient forest, or what was left of it. And they're still threatened. The whole world's threatened. But I think there's a hopeful message that even in the darkest times, you struggle and you win, and so, transporting myself back in time, that was really heavy then. And now listening to this incredible podcast, it was just amazing. Like, wow, we made it this far. And so anyway.
Well, I had an incredible experience when we were being interviewed by Aaron, because he had been doing so much research and he had all the dates and times and sequence of events, and he'd be like, well, what about this week? Oh yeah, I forgot about that. And that's how that worked. And it was just really fun when he interviewed us, because he reminded us so much of the pieces of the story that sometimes we just forgotten because it was a long time ago, or that maybe we didn't even know. And so he filled in a lot of gaps that was really fun to go through and kind of reminisce with him because of that. He prompted us a lot to kind of recall some things. But, Brighton Bush, that action is really fixed for me as a turning point in my life. One of the major turning points of my life. Not only did I become aware of what was happening in the old growth, being a recent transplant from the East Coast, but I met like some of the people who would become the most important people to this day in my life, including this guy, but many of my dearest friends. And like you said, Brenna, I'm honored when you even say that about us, because I met these people who loomed so large for me in terms of how I learned to be an activist in the world, and nonviolent direct action, and having integrity, and having like the ability to just be willing to put your body on the line, and people who just modeled that and taught me that. And that was just such a seminal event for me. But then listening to it was amazing, and further identified where we were in that moment in time in this huge sequence of events. And I think it was humbling, and it was kind of awe-inspiring to think that we were there when these things unfolded. And I kind of felt a little bit like Forrest Gump, like I just was there. This whole thing was happening. And I just want to acknowledge the people that laid the groundwork for that, the people I learned from. I mean, I was just a nobody at that event. And it's a privilege to get to tell that story that was so important for me personally. But there was just dozens and hundreds of people that played pivotal roles in that, and many other actions. So I just want to shout out to all of them, that our story is only possible because of them. And we're just, such a small part of the big picture of people who made it all happen and are continuing to make it happen, like you, Brenna, and all the BARC folks and everybody who's working on climate now. But Aaron, big nod to you. That was just beautifully done. And I was driving over to little local natural food store to grab something for dinner when I heard my voice on NPR. I was like, what happened?
That is awesome. Aaron also recounted to me that a piece he wanted to put in, but couldn't, was about you and your dog wrapped in a blanket while you were doing the interview. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mama's boy.
somehow the dog didn't make it into the cut, but thank you. And, thanks also. You're going to come back in episode 6. And if you want to comment on that one again, because I know that, the Easter Massacre was an event, but Warner Creek was like a life. And so, yeah, we'll pop back to that. But thank you so much for, of course, everything and being special guests in this. We're going to move to episode 2, the Norm and Jerry show. So I loved episode 2. Oh my gosh, because I am an ecology geek, and Norm and Jerry just factor large in the mythos of forest research and forest science. A couple years back, they got on the wrong side of environmentalists a little bit, but we don't need to go into that for these purposes. It just was such a pleasure to hear the story. I think one of my favorite reflections was how much the Forest Service hated their work, and the dean of the forestry school just hated it. I don't think that I was aware of the internal resistance in the agency or how transformational that work was. But my main question was, to you, how did your time with them help frame your approach to this entire podcast? And what did you learn? Like, being in the field with Norm and Jerry is like dreamy for most environmentalists. Like, you got this special experience. How did it shape the whole podcast, and how did it shape your own understanding of the forests?
I mean, I will not look at forests again after driving through clear cuts particularly that trip from Falls City, kind of winding through the Coast Range to the Valley of the Giants, where you just drive through everything. You start out in the industrial clear cuts, and then we kind of came to some clear cuts where they tried to follow the Oregon forest, the I can never remember the proper name, but left a couple snags and left a couple legacy trees and maybe a little bit of a stream buffer. And then you could kind of instantly tell the second you pass from private land into BLM land, because even though this was second growth, there was actually some plants on the ground, and there was a salmonberry and some, more ferns. And it's kind of like, I would hear like the inner logger in me would be like, oh, this is a messy forest. That it's messy in this way that is also natural, because nature is messy. And then to come into the old growth and watch Jerry come alive. So they just so complicated my view of forests, because I'll drive, before that, I would see a forest and be like, oh, well, this is a pine forest. And, this is you could kind of be like, well, the trees are different, but I never saw them as a snapshot in time that each, I just kind of assumed, oh, well, those are big trees. They've been there for a long time, and had not really looked at forests in the way of like each one of these, for the most part, has human fingerprints all over it.
Right.
And the question of what it looks like now is so determined by what has been done to it 20 years ago, 40 years ago, or 100 years ago. I was actually writing this kind of the tail end from my childhood home in Colorado, and I was looking at the forests up in the mountains there and being like, oh, there's actually that weird little foundation I used to play in the woods as a kid was a mill. And that actually means that these trees here probably are not the trees that were here before settlers came and cut them down to make cabins. So it's even these forests that I did take for granted as places that you play and are as old as those hills, I have to realize, no, these are also bearing our touch as humans, and they have been changed. And so in all these places we walk through, it's nature, but it's nature interlaced with humanity. And even before settlers, many of the indigenous tribes here.
That was my next question.
Absolutely managed these forests in ways that were probably much better for the forest than we handle them today. But so before then, it's because you read some of those historical accounts, and it's Lewis and Clark kind of coming through these forests and thinking of them like parks, because they didn't have the thick underbrush we have in some places today, because they were periodically burned. In many places, they
Yeah. There's a question.
And so
question in the chat right there that was specifically about that.
And so yes, and we mentioned indigenous burning in episode 6. We don't get into it nearly as much as I wish we did, and that is my biggest criticism of the podcast. It's something that I did explore a lot in the field guide story I did before about fire and wildlife, and exploring especially the relationship between fire and smoke and salmon. But yeah, so I would say Jerry and Norm, I mean, just so enriched my view of the forest. And I mean, they're just both such cantankerous old men, like just watching them relate to each other. And kind of, I'd show up, I mean, we did kind of this epic 3-day interview marathon up at Jerry's house where I'd kind of go over in the morning. We do like 2 hours of interview. We break for lunch, do 2 hours of interview, do a nap break because Jerry needed a nap, and then like come back and then have dinner. And they never stop talking about forests and research. I mean, it's like they literally like have just this stack of bulletins and research papers and scientific journals on the counter. And like in the down moments, one of them will pick one of them up and start talking about it. And the other will have an inside story about that researcher or what he thinks is wrong with that study. I mean, these men live and breathe this in a way that I can't imagine committing. I mean, it's a lifetime of research and of advocating and for being criticized by both sides. I mean, kind of the resistance that they've faced on every front through the years, and they still do it. And like that to me is very inspiring to see. And whether, you know, you believe all their science is right or wrong, or whether they're always going to be on the right side of history, or whether they suck up more of the spotlight than maybe they deserved, other researchers, I mean, it's all completely debatable, but they've spent their life on this in a way that I think very few of us have dedicated ourselves to something. So that to me was really inspiring.
Just that idea of all those interviews almost answers my last question, which is, are there any moments of awesomeness that didn't make the cut? I'm imagining that you have hours of interesting.
Yeah, they definitely, I'm trying to think of, there were a number of stories, I mean, involving Jack Ward Thomas and the Gang of Four, and kind of, I mean, it's, you know, I really wanted Jerry in there passing notes with Al Gore during the Forest Conference, because they were sitting next to each other and Al Gore was scribbling on his napkin and like passing questions over to Jerry, and Jerry was writing and passing notes back to him. And so, I mean, they are, you know, two people who started out in science and then kind of worked and ended up sitting next to the vice president, and then came home and just went back to work. But yeah, there was some stories, and I'm of course going to completely forget them now. There's a lot of stuff that ended up on the cutting floor.
No, maybe you should do an outtakes version at some point.
Yeah. As well as a lot of their colleagues that they talk about. I mean, they were very, you know, there was many people that they talked about who we ended up not including Gordy Reeves, who was on that road, that trip with us, and Norm's wife. And it was just one of those things where you start to add too many people and it's just really hard for the listener to follow. So like we made decisions that I felt horrible about, of being like, well, we're in a car with 8 adults and we're only going to hear from 2 of them.
Right.
Because otherwise it just starts to get too confusing, and then it turns into 60 minutes of programming, not 60 minutes of the TV show.
Well, for time, I do want to, you know, encourage people. Thank you so much for using the chat. I will kind of keep my eyes on that, and if you want to raise your hand, then we can see you. So it looks like there's a question about your previous documentary, Aaron.
Yes.
Is there a way that people can get a hold of that?
Yes, I am posting that.
All right. Awesome. Sometimes it's hard to multitask links and talking, but look, you just did it. That's perfect. We're going to shift to it's funny, episode 3, I was like, I don't actually want to talk about this because I think the owls get too much play. And I've been long troubled by the loggers versus owls narrative. And, I think that to me, the most troubling thing of this whole podcast series was how it played into that narrative. You tried to pop it out a little bit and said there were more things going on, but still it ends up centered in that, right? Owls are fascinating. I love them. They're still declining. It's sad. In that way, I think that there's a lot that I want to talk about episode 5 of whether or not the Northwest Forest Plan worked. My notes I have for this is you introduce them as the spotted owl is either the hero of the story or the villain, right? But it's not, it's the scapegoat, which I think you refer to it in a different episode. And I just want your reflection on that sense that to so many people, it's like the bird, it was all the bird's fault, but really the bird just took the fall for the change in culture and ecology that we were talking about.
And yeah, I think that's totally true. Although interestingly, I still, like many people I talk to, referred to these as the owl wars instead of the timber wars, which fits into that narrative. I agree. I actually, the first draft had a much bigger section in which we get way deeper into automation and international import. And it was all with this economist, Richard Haynes from the Forest Service, who also is then one of the lead witnesses at the Dwyer hearings. And we ended up cutting it all because my producers and everybody who listened basically were like, oh my God, this is so boring.
I would have loved that.
And I shouldn't say, and I'm sorry, that was actually in episode 4. We did that for episode 4, and everyone was kind of like, this is taking us too far from the town. We want to hear about the town. So it definitely did get greatly reduced. And I also used a lot of archival tape about people kind of, I think one piece still made it in there of a mill worker shouting like, it's not the owl's fault.
This is a cover up. This is a cover up.
And so, yeah. And that comes down to, we confined the owl to one episode, but it's like everywhere in this project were choices of like, which threads do we pull and which ways do we go? And so much of it was basically me trying to nuance and complicate and dive into things, and my editors being like, no, you only got one thought right here. You can have one thought. What is your one thought? And so, I did my best, but yeah, it's in an ideal world that would have been more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
And yes, and to this newest point, the marble murrelet got cut. There was a moment in there where I kind of tried to expand, and then the fight went from just the owl to we had the marble murrelet
and all the survey and managed species.
Yeah. Salmon, we try to play in kind of into the Gang of 4. We introduced salmon with the Gang of 4 later in episode 5. But it was definitely this thing of me trying to add more and my editors constantly trying to take it back out. Right. So yeah, I'm even working on a field guide story about marbled murrelets right now. That I had all this great stuff that could have been in there, but I just basically told you get one bird. What's your one bird?
But murrelets are so cool. Yeah. But yeah, you did real well with that bird. Going out with Eric Forsman. These are all the names of all these people, aside from your timber people, are all as an environmentalist, are the names that have just been with me for the past 25 years. And it was really awesome to hear them have voice and hear them reflect on that, getting Andy Stahl in there, and he's still, rabble rousing his thing. I loved your the praise of William Dwyer. I think he's, the lawyer in me got all teary-eyed because he was the kind of judge that makes you actually want to trust the judicial system, which I tend to not. But it was beautiful. I just still I hear that it was a push-pull between your nuancing the story and the editors simplifying it. Because most of the audiences aren't people like the Bark people who would have loved to get in the weeds.
Yeah, and I mean, I also wanted, I mean, to me, one of the new pieces of that story was how much environmentalists resisted using the owl to begin with, and like the fear of the backlash, and then that coming to be true. And like, you know, you could argue that it was a legal strategy that was really potent, but from kind of the public opinion and the political strategy, if they had not pursued the owl in the courtroom, and if they continued this fight along the lines of, you know, we need to protect these old growth forests, would things have ended up differently? Like, and we don't explore
we don't know
things, but like, you know, it's like you could maybe like, you probably wouldn't have stopped logging as quickly, but maybe without the owl becoming a scapegoat, I mean, who knows? It could have been very different, because it did definitely kind of turn people against the Endangered Species Act and turn them against some of these environmental laws that maybe they had not seen as bad things up until or had seen as good things. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's a question that goes right into what I wanted to talk about in episode 4. If you want to look at that, the slashing of jobs through automation. Yeah, isn't there a way that editorial choice just plays into continuing that narrative?
Yes, I mean, we tried. Yeah, I mean, I guess like, I feel like you can't not tell the story of the owl to do the timber wars. Mm-hmm. So it's like we tried to complicate it to the extent that we could. And and I mean, we didn't get into, in many cases, the industry versus the workers nearly as much as I would have liked to. And I think that's maybe a question for your next, maybe episode 4, but like
it is episode 4
to me also is something I wish we could have really spent a little more time in, and just did not do it for, I mean, all sorts of reasons that are both intentional and accidental. So.
Yeah, it does make sense. It's funny. The episode 4 is the one that, you know, when I was binge listening again, I just took the most notes on, because the rest of the story has affected my personal and professional life since I was, you know, a baby activist. But hearing the inner workings of the timber town, hearing their experience of it, it was like eavesdropping on conversations that I will never be privy to, because of my position and like what I represent when I'm working as an environmental lawyer from the city. I mean, they don't know that I'm a rural girl from like Cowtown who had, you know, friends whose dads were loggers. That branding means I won't ever get to hear those conversations. So it was interesting. Part I was thinking about your position as the storyteller. You had access to people on all sides of the story, talking to you candidly in ways that we never talk to each other. And that's, I think, why I have so many more notes on episode 4, because it was like hearing those different stories that I never really would. I loved your Romeo Club guys. And I think there's a way that it becomes more of a human story. Like, you know, there is tragedy and change. There's a part of me that's like, industries change, you know? A lot of us have used the example, good or bad, of the South after slavery. Like, could we grieve for all the cotton plantations who lost their workers, even though they had enslaved them? Well, like, I would say, no, I am not going to grieve for that lifestyle. It was a bad lifestyle. It was exploiting people. But then I'm like, oh, I will grieve for you loggers, but in a different, decidedly different way. It was also a lifestyle that was based on capitalist exploitation, right? And yet when you hear them, they're these old guys who love the forest, you know, really love the forest. Some of them, and I think that environmentalists can forget that people can love the forest in different ways. I
think that's absolutely true. And I mean, to listen, like, especially when I connected to people in Mill City after the fires, and to them, like, it's heartbreaking to have seen these forests burn. And to them, it's, you know, whether right or wrong, it's because we're not managing them. So it's like it
Wrong.
goes back to that different worldview. Like they think, many of the people I spoke with feel like the way that they were managing the forest was in the best interest of the forest. And so it's like that's where it becomes really difficult to try to see from somebody else's perspective. But yeah, it's time and time again, especially the fellows in the Romeo Club, the retired old men eating out, like they're heartbroken about the forests now, because they would say, like, you know, we drive out and like it's overgrown and the trees are being eaten by insects. And I mean, it's a lot of it is talking points, I think, but there is the sense that like a number of them are Stefan Weaver, the logger we start with. They're like, you go up into the forest that we logged 40 years ago, like it looks like a great, beautiful forest. And we love to camp in it, and we love to hunt in it, and we love to hike in it. And like to them, that feels like a good forest. So it does kind of come to this difference in what you feel humans' role is in the world. Like, are we kind of apart from things and we shouldn't be involved? Or are we I mean, whether you believe for religious or other reasons, you know, that we have a role to manage things. But like for a lot of them, they do absolutely love the forest, and they think that this hands-off approach is absolutely in the worst interests. So it was really, I mean, it's very interesting to go from talking with someone who put their life on the line to protect a tree to then someone who feels like, you know, I mean, admits that, yeah, that's a beautiful tree I'm cutting down, but it'll grow back and the forest will look even better than it does right now. So
Yeah, I just saw in the chat someplace where I did want to go, that the question of like, didn't these owl controversies just speed up what would have inevitably happened? Kind of where I started with earlier, that sense that you can't just keep logging old growth forever, you know, because people said, oh, we were blindsided by this, or we didn't know. But then at the same time, you also mentioned that unions had been warning for decades that companies were logging too fast and that the workers would suffer. And so that was known, right? But somehow the spotted owl didn't just accelerate, it shifted. It created a common enemy between the bosses and the workers. And I would say that as a failure of intersectional organizing in some ways. Like if the environmentalists would have organized with the unions to slow things down, it could have been very different. You know, like what happened in Humboldt, what happened with Judy Berry, why the feds hated her so much, because she was doing that, saying, this isn't good for you workers. You are going to log yourself out of jobs. But we didn't do that up here. It was the more like adversarial approach that then pitted everyone against the environmentalists and the owls. But how could it have blindsided them if the unions were already warning this?
yeah, and I mean,
it's kind of rhetorical.
Yeah, well, and I think also, you know, there's the aspect of, you know, this is pre-internet. This is pre everybody kind of like, it's kind of a matter of were you in that union with that union representative? Was that the representative in the next town over? Like, you know, I think like we live in our, like, especially back then, you lived in your little community. So like, what happened the next valley over, or the big picture of what's going on across the forest on a landscape scale is not easy to wrap your head around. There was no Google Earth. There was no aerial views unless you were in airplanes. And I mean, that in many ways is kind of what sparked a lot of this conflict, was people flying and people seeing these clear cuts, because there wasn't this kind of grand eagle's eye view of what was going on. So, I mean, like I'm speaking completely, or not hypothetically, but like, you know, this is not based on research so much as just me trying to put myself in the perspective of somebody in one of these towns in 1982. You kind of knew what was going on in your little stretch of the forest, but I think, you know, it was only people who had kind of greater access to bigger picture vantage points, and you know, and then it's all a matter of how they spread that word and how they form alliances, and to your point, how the environmentalists kind of frame issues. And do you go in kind of initially to build relationships first, or do you go in kind of in a more oppositional manner? So Yeah, and I think, I mean, the other thing I would say to your comment about them kind of knowing what they're doing, the rest of America was using this wood. So, I mean, it's to them, they were doing a good thing. Like, people were buying the wood, they were building houses, they were reading newspapers. So it's like, I think for them, it felt like we're providing something that all these people use, including all the environmentalist newsletters. Like, why should we be demonized for something that everyone is buying and depending on? So like, and I mean, one thing I didn't explore also was a lot of the counter argument from loggers was, great, well, you don't log these forests, we're now going to go log overseas in old growth forests,
Right.
which is a whole argument to explore, which we didn't, because it almost, I mean, it's too complicated and didn't fit in. But to them, it felt like we care about these forests, whereas now if you don't cut this, you cut the Amazon or whatnot. So and there are many problems with that argument.
Yeah.
But
I mean, in the ideal world, we'd organize together with the workers to take down capitalism, and that would be the solution to, otherwise it's like whack-a-mole, right? And it's a legit concern, is that the timber companies will go where there are just fewer regulations, because and because everyone's being exploited under this setting. And I'm sure that's also a bigger topic than you could cover in the podcast, and maybe not wouldn't cross OPB's editorial approval to say, really the problem here is capitalist exploitation of workers and the environment. But it's a commonality that we didn't, in bits and spurts. Again, in the chat, somebody gave an example of some places that has worked, but isn't something that in the big narrative we've been successful doing in this work, which again has fueled a lot of that resentment that you've talked about, because people didn't see their commonalities between the two. I will note, just for how history repeats itself, you talked about the recession in the 80s that both broke the unions and also closed a lot of mills, and how the mills that kept running mechanized so they could do the work with fewer workers. And that's exactly what happened again after the 2008 and 2009 recession in Oregon. Some of the mills that were still going shut down, and all those that remained again retooled. And so the line has now, the Oregon Department of Labor keeps really amazing statistics on the logging industry, and they show that the volume now is steadily increasing since 2011, where now the jobs are decreasing and they're across. And so when you hear that there should just be more logging, so that we have more jobs, now that the gap is getting wider, consistently getting wider between volume and jobs. And then it used to be that there were, like you said, fellers, right? Stefan with his 50-inch bar. All of that is done by feller bunchers now. And it used to just be that they would have loggers still on steep slopes, but now the industry is doing tethered feller bunchers. And I don't know if you got into this with loggers.
No, I was actually hoping Tony was thinking of exploring that and didn't end up doing it. And that, and to what you're saying of like the coinciding of that technological advance with maybe an environmental regulation that then takes the blame. So I
exactly.
mean, the tethered feller bunchers with then potentially bans on aerial spraying, or changes that are going now, that it then gives another kind of environmental regulation to blame for the loss of jobs that is caused by technology. So
exactly, and that has been a consistent pattern in the industry, and still people keep saying we just need more logging because there'll be more jobs. Well, that is, it's part of that mythos. Like you began talking about the mythos of the logger. Now there's a mythos in Oregon that logging equals jobs. But only 2% of our economy, the state's GDP, is connected to it. And the number of jobs that supports is steadily decreasing. And yet still it looms large in our cultural myth. We are not that far from this, that it's still there. But I think that is a point that, I would love to pop out in the storytelling more, is how those industries change to meet their own bottom lines, but how they place the blame on whether it's the legislation, whether it's the government or the activists, but never on their own bottom line.
Yeah, and that We actually, I mean, some of the Oregon Department of Labor statistics I had in there, kind of the point at which tech and logging kind of crossed as the bigger or employing industries. So it is something that I hate saying this again. It's something like I had him more, and we cut it. Because in large part because it's when you start to hear it, like it's something that is easier to read, and so to tell that in an audio story, like you kind of, it's like, what is the character and what is it's you kind of have to weave those big points in between action and people, and so it almost, I mean, now that we're talking about it and I'm thinking about it, it's like, I mean, what I almost needed was more of an episode or a moment where we're with a mill worker, where we're actually exploring. So it's because I tried to put them in a way that was a little bit more of a writing a report sort of way, which with an economist, and that was what my producers were like, no, this is not going to cut it in a podcast. And so, I mean, that's all comes down to, the storytelling of who are the people and how do we tell this story that convince my boss to give me another year, and we'll get it in there.
So I'm going to pop to episode 5 because we're, running out of time, and I know people want to talk about episode 7. And Mia just asked if you're going to have a book that contains all of this stuff. So maybe put that next on your bucket list. My main question with episode 5 is you started with this very ominous intro, where you say, just because you mean well doesn't mean you end well. And was that your editorial perspective on the Northwest Forest Plan being a failure? Like, where does that come from?
Let's see here. I have to try to put myself in the mindset of that sentence. I think I was trying to communicate that for Clinton, it didn't feel like a win to him. Like, it wasn't, in my mind, evaluating the forest plan 10 years later. It was more so kind of, he set out to solve this, and then what he ended up kind of putting into policy was not something that felt like a good solution for him, because he was the people person who, like, he thought that he could protect these forests and log these forests in a way that would keep a lot more timber flowing out of the woods. And, like, I mean, to his credit, he put it out with, even though it didn't deliver the amount of wood that he had hoped for. But so I think I was trying to write a little bit more from his perspective, but I can totally see in retrospect that it comes across in a different way.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were referring to, like, in your own retrospective, talking to all these people about the plan, it felt like, kind of because nobody was happy, it was a bad plan, which, I mean, you could get to that place.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of where we were getting at it in that time. And this also comes back to the constant problem we had of how much do we bounce to today versus how much do we stay in the history, like, especially with the owl episode of, like, do we jump to how the owl's doing now, or do we stay in this moment in 1990, 89, 1990, and then wait to come back to the owl, which was a problem because we got to our last episode and I'm like, holy shit, we've not come back to the owl. What do we do? How do we get this owl back into how do we address the state of the spotted owl today? Because we didn't get back to it. So, I mean, and so in that moment, that was a little bit more trying to stay, like, within that year of releasing the plan, that there were these high hopes that I think, as nobody came out happy. So, like, it didn't feel in the time like it was a happy ending. Even though I think for some people it felt like, well, this sucks, but maybe this will actually solve the issue in a way that then gets kind of detonated by the salvage logging writer of
exactly. I just threw my pen at you. And I want to go to the chat. There's a question from Amanda, and I think you do have a resource list, don't you?
Yes, let me post it. I have a resource list that is like the beginning, and of course it could be way longer, but I will paste it in here. It's down at the bottom of this page, and it's got a number of the books. I mean, there's some really great books written on this. They all kind of end before the forest plan. So to the other point about writing a book, it is probably a good time to write a book, particularly as we're reevaluating the Northwest Forest Plan or revisiting the Northwest Forest Plan. And then of course, you know, there's there's some other documentaries in here, and then a number of the bigger reports that are a little bit more evaluative of the Northwest Forest Plan.
Okay, we're pushing up on our time. This is so much fun. Episode 6. So I had, again, a special heart for this because in my personal narrative, I got involved in forest defense because of the salvage rider in 1997. So I just missed Warner Creek to like my everlasting FOMO. I mean, it's like, so I got involved. I was like, what just happened? And I wasn't there. So, you know, I'm glad that you highlighted that because that truly was just this watershed moment. I mean, what I don't think I realized at the point, I definitely didn't realize when I was just 22 and just getting involved in salvage. I mean, in forest activism, I didn't realize the betrayal. You know, I didn't get that. Kind of had it in my head since then, but listening to your story of it, listening to the buildup from the 80s to that point, it felt so much more like, how could they have done that? How could they have done the whole Timber Summit, done the whole plan, and then just tossed it all out the window? I mean, if I had been an activist or a scientist who'd been working on that, I think it would have been devastating. As I was just excited about trees, wanted to hang out in the forest. But the gravity of it, I think, hit me more listening to the podcast. So I just want to say thank you for like helping me understand my own history a little bit better. And then also it helps contextualize the fight at Warner Creek and how that sparked similar fights. Like in Mount Hood National Forest, it was Eagle Creek. That was a campaign I was part of for 7 years. We actually got it stopped after we got Jerry Franklin out in the forest with us, which was fantastic, and got him to try and convince the Forest Service and Ron Wyden. But it also took tree sitting, road blockades, public education. I mean, we used a lot of Warner Creek's tools about that. So I won't ask why you focused on Warner, because A, it was the coolest thing that ever happened in the forest, and B, it let you bring Tim and Katya back.
You just answered your question.
You know, and so I wanted to pop over to them for one more moment. And again, you know, Warner Creek was a transformative moment in your all's lives. And again, that question of what did it feel like to hear this story told?
Long story.
It's a long story.
You got to do the short version.
Yeah. It was great. I mean, again, like to have Aaron piece together all of that whole sequence of events and to really contextualize it, it was great to revisit it and to remember why that campaign singularly was able to do what it could do, because it was the first test case of those environmental laws getting thrown out the window. And I thought it was really great how, you know, you interviewed Rich Fairbanks, who is such a character in this podcast, such a character. And he's actually a good friend of ours because of Warner Creek and because of, you know, all the way that it unfolded. But, you know, how he was like, yeah, that was crazy that they thought they were going to stop that logging. That was never going to happen. And
The thing is typical of all recounts of Warner Creek, they start with direct action. And Katya and I have been going through years of Forest Service meetings and talking to dozens and dozens of people all over the Northwest, bringing hundreds to the place itself. And that was the kind of hidden, inglorious grunt work of organizing that really created that community resistance that was loved the place, bonded to it, and committed. So when it came time for that direct action, every other legal, civil, process was exhausted. We had a solid foundation. So
yeah, we estimated we took about 1,000 people up to Warner Creek before that court case happened and before the direct action happened. I mean, we have been having fire ecology field conferences, we called them, campouts in the woods with scientists and activists and researchers, and taking people up to those burned units and trying to retell a story about a forest that has experienced fire, because it was so unique at the time to be able to go and see a forest that wasn't salvage logged. And so we took advantage of that period of time to get as many people out there as we could to tell that story. And now it's so important with climate change and what's happening in the forest in the context of forest fires. So we have an area that's had 30 years of natural regrowth. It hasn't had any salvage logging, that had 100% clear cut forest land that burned over, and pristine meadows that burned over, and pristine old growth that burned over. And so we have this whole research base now where we can go and help understand better the role of fire in the forest. And, that's essential that we have that. So
best kept secret on the Willamette National Forest, natural recovery from wildfire, a miracle of nature. Well, it's really an amazing place, a jungle of post-fire recovery. It's really amazing place.
Well, thank you. And thank you for just the amazing work and time and dedication it took back then to save it, and, ongoing, keeping the story alive. I also noticed that every man involved was named Tim.
That was the problem. We had to cut out Tim.
Tim Lewis? Because there's Tim Ream and Tim Lewis and Tim
Like, it started out with a joke about there's about to be a lot of Tims in this episode.
Exactly.
And then we're kind of like, well, maybe Tim Lewis, like, he kept walking away from our interview anyhow to let Tim Ream do all the talking. So, like, I don't think he'll mind if we just don't put him in there at all.
But there was a good question in the chat that a lot of people seconded about this positioning direct action as of something that was in the past. And I know that you came out to a climb training that I was at, and we have been talking to direct action activists now, but what was your sense of not bringing that into the contemporary story?
And that, now this is another thing where I'm like, God, I wish I would have wrapped that in. It's in another world. If I could rewrite the ending, like, we would put in there something about like, that's still happening. I think part of it, and I was saving this for kind of the discussion of episode 7, but there was supposed to be an episode 8. And I guess it's very germane to Tim and Katya, because it was supposed to partially feature their daughter. And the original outline I had done for the series, we kind of ended on Juliana versus government, and kind of the movement of the forest from this fight over forests to protect certain species or biodiversity to the place forests, the realization that they play a huge role in climate, and the fight to protect forests as a piece of how we need to address climate change. And then also bring into that too, timber unity and kind of the fight over cap and trade, which we are going to tell through the son of Stephen Weaver, who is a log truck driver. And so, like, my beautiful way of wrapping it up was this kind of chapter that comes back that is taking it into the next generation. And in the end, basically, we ran out of time. And with my boss, I had pushed way beyond my deadlines, and kind of our team was like, we should just end right here. It's a really good ending right on the Blue Mountain Forest Partners. Like, that next one, even NPR, our kind of mentors at NPR, were like, I don't know, that sounds like a whole different, save that for season 2.
No, see that you had the wrong audience. You weren't tracking your audience, because we had episode 7, and we're like, this isn't the end.
Yeah. So I think partly there, it all comes down to choices. Like, there was actually, for a long time, I waffled between, do we do Warner Creek or do we do an episode? I really wanted to do an episode that was spent pretty much the entire time in a tree with a tree sitter. So, I mean, and that was part of that reporting trip that I came out to the farm at, that was kind of the thought of like, we've been talking about these big issues and lots of people at the table, and how wonderful would it be to spend one episode confined to, you know, a 4x4 or 6x6 platform up in a tree. And it was one where like I started making some inroads, and then we kind of were like, we had to make choices, and we decided that we would go with Warner Creek, both because to me, like, I love, Tim and Katya, having you both kind of getting that progression of one of the first actions. And I mean, in choosing to tell Easter Massacre through your eyes is really important to me, because it brings the listener in as someone who'd be new to this. Like the idea of this, somebody bursts into the room and says like, you need to get in this van, we need to go save these trees. Like that to me is a really powerful way to begin, because anyone could put themselves in those shoes. Whereas, you know, I think there's individuals from like that action who are like, why didn't you begin with the people organizing the action and the people who'd spent years working on this? And I mean, in one version, I'd gone into kind of the back and forth of the lawsuits over the North Roaring Devil sale. And it kind of from this, that's where you have to make those storytelling choices, where it felt more compelling to kind of immerse yourself in the newcomer. And then for me, Warner Creek was really powerful, because it's like kind of, you know, what happens to those people who get thrown in the deep end and now work and like then build something more. It also, I mean, a big reason was because of the Pickaxe documentary, we had really good archival audio. And like, even though I said, you know, we wanted to do a podcast because it doesn't rely on stuff, it's really made stronger when you have material. And part of the reason the Easter Massacre worked is because there was so many news reports from there that we could have this audio of the sheriffs arresting Leo and pulling him out of the rock pyramid and whatnot. And so like Warner Creek was great because there was so much wonderful audio, because Tim and Tim spent that time recording it. And whereas, you know, to my knowledge, there were no tree sitters who had a little like old-fashioned Walkman up there recording their audio diaries, although maybe there were, and maybe we completely missed out on the best episode ever. But yeah, so I mean, these were all kind of the points, especially the second half of the podcast, like to peel back the creative curtain, where it comes down to kind of like, okay, we've gotten through the Northwest Forest Plan, like now there's so many years to cover in that time. How far do we go? Where are the places we stop? And so I think that fell by the wayside, and I do regret, I mean, that wasn't a thread we could wrap in, or a reflection I could have made at some point to be like, the activism in the forest is not a thing of the past. This is still going on. But I mean, frankly, it's the human failing on my part of, you get so many threads weaving that, and you have so many documents of things that you want to try to cover and notes that you lose threads.
Mm-hmm. I am wondering, is there a link to Pickaxe on your reference page?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
There's a credit and no. Oh my God, Brenna.
You can get it on YouTube.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. And
I would advise anyone who doesn't know about the Warner Creek story to watch Pickaxe. It is a fascinating, fantastic documentary about this action that really, you know, was one of those moments that changed the way the forest activism happened. So check that out. And I have another question that I'm going to raise for us to talk about later, and then I can report back to people. I am wondering why you didn't talk about the Green Scare. And maybe that's just, no, you can't answer because we need to talk about episode 7. But that has been a question out there, and I'm going to have a follow-up conversation and let folk know, because that was another that, you know, fascinating thing. It was like the pushback from the government against activists that happened after Warner Creek. But we need to get to episode 7, and we're already slightly over time. I understand if people need to leave. But this one is a great story. And, I've already let you know a few of my kind of qualms about it. Of all of them, it rankled me the most because, I know Susan Jane. We went to law school together. I really admire her work, but it's of such a different feel and thread than all the other work in the Timber Wars, right? Like when you're talking about episode 8, you're almost following like the same characters and their offsprings in the same places, doing the work on the West Side forests that, with the owl and the carbon and the old growth. And then all of a sudden we're in Eastern Oregon, right? And it sounds like people liked that because it was a feel-good ending, right? Rather than the Timber Wars never ended. They're still going on. Here's what they look like. And was that kind of the editorial choice to end on something that like, why can't we all just get along end?
No, actually we didn't. I mean, I explicitly didn't want to end on it for that reason. It was more the matter of we at a certain point had to make the decision of we can't do this last episode. So how can we make the Blue Mountain Forest Partners our final episode? Which is, why we started. And it was also going to start with Timber Unity and Cap and Trade, and then the fires happened, and then it was like, holy shit. Like now, that also then got us to a point of like, how much of the entire series do we blow up? Like,
right.
Do we need to redo things to reflect the fact that, the Breitenbush and these forests where a lot of this happened burned, and that Mill City, we added like just a little coda, but like, I was basically sitting there watching Twitter trying to be like, is the Mountain Cafe still there?
Right.
Like, do we need to put in something saying like these places aren't there? But I actually very much didn't want to end on something that didn't want to end on for that reason. We basically ran out of time. I think we actually saw it as a bit of a strength that it was not, it was a problem, but I saw pros and cons to the fact that it wasn't within the Northwest Forest Plan because the Timber Wars were not confined to the Northwest Forest Plan. The Northwest Forest Plan exists because it's the range of the spotted owl, but the Forest Summit, like it was a huge frustration of environmentalists that they couldn't get the East Side at the table.
Right.
Like they pushed and pushed to have East Side, the Cascades included in the conversation. And like, it was a huge frustration that kind of the Clinton administration were like, we're going to stick to the owl because that's where we're stuck in court. And we need to find a solution to these court cases. And we're not quite willing to push hard enough and like detonate, the fact that the head of the House of Representatives, the Democratic head of the House of Representatives was in Eastern Washington in the Timber District.
But the funny thing is the East Side of Oregon got the East Side screens, which actually prohibited logging old growth, any trees over 21 inches. And the Northwest Forest Plan does not prohibit logging old growth.
Yeah, so it's different rules, but to us that still create, the social elements were the same. It was still these logging communities who are watching their mills close and are feeling this feeling of environmentalists are locking up the forest, combined with then, this very real environmental sentiment of we are logging these forests, and those forests grow back even slower. So there's different like, and consequently we're not clear cut the same way. But so to us, it was a pro and a con that it was outside. Like it did make it harder narratively to figure out like, how do we get in, survey and manage? But at the same point, it was kind of showing that these are bigger issues. My other regrets are that we didn't spend any time in the Redwoods. We didn't spend any time on the Olympic Peninsula. There's so many places to cover. In large part, I had actually started reporting that before the podcast because we were doing a field guide episode or story about the Blue Mountain Forest Partners. So like in some ways, it was the clearest confined narrative of here's conflict and here is a little bit of resolution, even though I think everyone there feels like it's tenuous. So yes, I totally hear the criticism. It's not the ideal ending. If there's like, it is my dream that we could do a second season that is focused a lot more on today particularly, I mean, as we revisit the Northwest Forest Plan and as the fight over fire, like basically, you know, in theory, and is going to really make this, I mean, put Northwest and West Coast forests back in national news in a way that they haven't really been since the height of the timber wars.
Well, that tees up my final question. I have more, but I'm noticing the time, and that's, you know, we're a bunch of activists, right? We want you to have a second season. I mean, it was excellent storytelling. It's fantastic to have this story back in the minds of the people who lived it, and to introduce a whole new generation of Oregonians and new people to it. So my question is, what can we do to advocate OPB to let you do it? I know we should all become members of OPB, because I am, by the way, because my son listens to it obsessively. And you told us at every break to do it. But beyond that, how can we agitate for season 2 of the Timber Wars?
I mean, OPB definitely does hear, like, we get forwarded anytime from our development department of like, I became a member because of Timber Wars. So, I mean, that does hear it. I, of course, don't want to advocate that people need to, I mean, we love our members and we love support, but like, I think just emailing to that effect, there is the Timber Wars email that I should remember. I think it's timberwars@opb.org.
And if people wrote that and said, we really, really want season 2, there's so much good stuff to cover, do you think that would help direct the editorial hand?
I mean, it will not hurt. Like, I think my boss feels the importance of this and the way it's resonating. And I think for him, it's very much a question of the resources. And I think for OPB, it's also, we've been, I mean, some radio stations have gone all in on podcasts, and then OPB, I think, is very much focused on news in large part because of the cutbacks of the Oregonian and other newspapers, and this feeling of like somebody needs to be reporting breaking news and following the legislature and following City Hall and like following the racial justice movement. Like, there's all these news stories we need to do. We don't have time to do podcasts. Mm-hmm. And so I think, you know, part of our project with this was trying to prove like these have audiences, these make differences in the world. So, I mean, I think writing to the membership department, writing to Steve Bass, our president, or writing to my boss, and I need to find the Timber Wars feed that I'm trying to.
Yeah. Well, while you're looking up, I'll say in the chat, and I also wanted to promote, you did have a bonus episode that came out that I would ask people to check out. It's got some of Tony Schick's reporting on the impacts of timber companies on local towns, and definitely talks a little bit more about that collaboration between local towns and environmentalists who are all getting impacted by the out-of-town interests who now own those private lands. So it's a bend away from the federal forests, but it's a great bonus episode. Is that also on the General Timber Wars podcast site?
Yeah, that's on opb.org/timberwars, or on an Apple Podcast. We will presumably have another bonus episode too that's looking more explicitly on fire and wildfire as it relates to timber management and the work of Tim and others, kind of trying to look at that narrative from the logging industry of we need to log more to prevent wildfire and how it's not backed up by the science. As well as it's waiting for, Tony was supposed to have a final story looking at the effects of industrial logging on water quality, particularly in like kind of the watersheds that provide water to so many of these coastal towns that are suffering the worst from the heavy clear cutting. I don't know that story will ultimately be done because he's moving on to his big next project, but so there should be one more bonus episode, and that I'm happy that he's doing that because that is definitely tackling some of the issues today and the economic issues that I stayed definitely more in the history with the idea that he would be exploring more of today's current issues, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome, Aaron. I want to let everyone go. Thank you so much for, all your artistic work and pulling that together. We do look forward to your book. It is good timing. They are talking about revising the forest plan. Also, if you look in the chat, Courtney just put up for the Barkers, a couple of final things. Michael and I will be talking about the Riverside fire and fire, I'll be talking about the history of fire in the area from colonization through climate change and talking about the specific impacts of Riverside. Then we'll be doing a People's Forest Forum. So those are two new Bark events coming up the 15th and 17th of December. And thank you everyone for joining this. This is the first time we've done something like this around the creative process and the content of the storytelling of the work that we do. And it was really fun to have everyone here. Special thanks to Tim and Katya for your lives, for being part of the podcast, and then for being our special guests tonight. And good luck on your future reporting, Aaron.
Thank you. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. Oh, no, I accidentally just chatted it to Lloyd privately. Lloyd, call me. But no, I'm sorry if we miss people in the chat. I'm not a good multitasker at talking and reading at the same time. But if you have any other questions, please email, or we're constantly looking for story ideas. Particularly, I primarily work on Oregon Field Guide, but if you know of interesting things going on outside or interesting people to profile or things happening, like, we're always looking for stories. So thank you for your time and for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Bye.